Menachem, welcome to the show. I would like to start this show with a very deep question, and I think it's one that often plagues me and probably many scientists today. What are your thoughts on the relationship between philosophy and science? Does science need philosophy, and vice versa?
Well, that is a tough and deep question, and there are several sides to it. I think, first of all, science embodies a philosophy, whether it articulates it. But very, very few scientists sort of stand back and articulate their philosophies. But the pictures they paint of nature embody philosophies, embody deep conceptions of the world, of its nature, of its basic building blocks, a whole normative system of assumptions and presumptions and background knowledge and so on and so forth, which never get articulated or hardly ever get articulated. And these you know, these include sort of classical philosophy of science questions. I mean, Kuhn is reported to have quit the following. He was asked, I mean, he finished a PhD in physics, and he was asked, you know, why he stopped being a scientist and became a philosopher of science. And he says, well, scientists deal with exploring the truth all day, every day, but never ask themselves what truth is, or what notion of truth they're exploring. They explain without ever giving themselves an account of what an explanation is and what it can and should achieve, and so on and so forth. So science, that would be the first point. Science embodies a philosophy. And I think philosophers of science, and you see this a lot in philosophies of the special sciences, specific sciences, like philosophy of physics, philosophy of biology, part of their task, not all of it, part of their task is to tease out and make explicit and articulate the philosophy embodied in. Okay, now there's another set of problems. And of philosophical issues that go along with science, and those have to do with the broader philosophical context within which physics and biology, and in our case neuroscience, brain research, ply their trade. It's not about their assumptions so much as about. Let me phrase it as follows. I mean, science by definition creates models of what it's researching. And those models are always, to some extent, larger or smaller, schematic. Okay, they're sort of, what would the word be? Abstracted. Okay, abstracted out of the phenomena they're researching. And there you always get a kind of distance between the objects that science researches, and a lot of the time fool themselves, or, you know, believe that this is the real world, these are, and, you know, what they represent or what they're abstracted from. So to take one example, Alfred North Whitehead, I mean, made much of this, that the philosopher and the poet are the people who are, you know, who really look the world in the eye, and it's their job to bring science, you know, sort of back to earth and reconnect them with reality, reconnect their abstractions with reality. That would be a second point. The third point is a negative point. I mean, what to my mind, philosophers of science sometimes do, but should not be doing, is outsmarting the scientists. I mean, there's a whole slew of philosophy of science work, which is engaged, I mean, to take an image from soccer, of pulling out no, this isn't soccer. This is
red card.
Yeah, red cards and yellow cards, and so on and so forth, and trying to criticize science from within. You know, that you're not living up to your own assumptions. Mm-hmm. Your concepts are vague, and this, that, and the other. And I myself view philosophy of science as a second order, absolutely second order undertaking. Where if science studies the world, we study science, not with a view to, you know, getting scientists to do their job better, but with a view to understanding the greatest adventure in town. So a biologist studying, to take a crude example, there's someone at Tel Aviv who used to do that. Say the sex life of hedgehogs is not trying, you know, to advise them on how they could do that better, right? Mm-hmm. So I mean, that's not the job of science. The job of science is to understand, and perhaps capitalize on that understanding in technology. Philosophy of science, the job of philosophy of science is not to teach the scientists how to do their job, but to understand what's going on. But having said all that, I think mind research poses, at the moment, a great philosophical challenge. I mean, here, I think, unlike any other area of scientific research, certainly at the moment, I think philosophers and brain scientists have something seriously to discuss, which goes to all the three things I've now.
Yeah, you've touched on something very important there, because, as you said, I mean, we human beings, we have this inability to escape normativity. I mean, when we approach any topic within the sciences, even as someone who loves science, I know that it's impossible for someone to just embark on a quest to find answers to something without applying some form of value or meaning to their task. When it comes to understanding the mind, and you said neuroscientists and philosophers need to have this discussion, I completely agree. I think there's so much that we have to firstly understand about ourselves in order to understand the mind itself. But do you think there is a possibility that neuroscientists will somehow bring us enough evidence to a point where we can use this information to make correct conclusions regarding the most infamous problem, the mind-body problem?
I think not. I think not. And I think not because of the first point I raised. Mm. And that is the philosophy embodied in brain research. Mm. Now, this is, I mean, you said you'd start with a deep problem, deep question. And I want to carry on now with a deep answer or a deep observation. Somewhere during the beginning of the 17th century, Western culture made a decision, okay, not a discovery, a decision. And the decision is that nature, the world around us, all included, right, is basically and fundamentally inanimate, non-living, okay? And hence the fundamental sciences are physics and chemistry, the sciences of the inanimate. And from that, now the Greek view is quite the opposite. Okay, the cosmos, I'm not talking about atomism now, but the cosmos is envisaged as organic, and the inanimate as sort of undeveloped organisms, right? But the scientific revolution, the deepest aspect, the most profound aspect of the scientific revolution is an endorsement of the view that the universe, that nature, that the natural world is basically inanimate, which turn organisms into complex inanimate objects. I mean, like Lego models. Now, what gives them their nervous systems and the way in which they're put together allows them to observe and to react and so on and so forth. We now have computers, so we know how inanimate bits and pieces can be combined to do all sorts of things. And biologists weren't very troubled by that view. They were troubled to a small extent, and that's the holism. Okay, the way in which an organism is more than the sum of its parts. I mean, the 18th century was very much taken up with this problem. But I think the inarticulated assumption was let physicists and chemists do their job and have their assumptions. It has no effect on how biology should conduct itself. And everything was fine until that scientific gaze was turned 180 degrees onto ourselves. Okay, and the sort of scientific program for the world was applied to human cognition, the human brain, the human mind, with the same standards of objectivity in the literal sense of the word, making it an object and an inanimate object primarily, an object which is vital. By virtue of the combination of its inanimate parts. And neuroscience is a physico-chemical science, right? I mean, that's what neurobiology is about. Now, why am I saying all this? Because the only motive force known by the sciences of the inanimate, physics and chemistry, is causal impact, right? Now, if one can speak of the very staple, okay, the very foundations of our self-image as human selves, that goes straight to the question you raised. It's the categorical difference between being given to an impulse or being motivated, self-motivated by a norm, by doing something because something is forcing me to do it, pushing me, causing me to do it, or because I find it appropriate to do. Okay? Now, the only way neuroscience can account for normativity is by reducing it to blunt causality, because that's the language it speaks, not because it's discovered anything. Okay, and there's nothing it can discover by means of that vocabulary which will transcend that vocabulary, because that's the vocabulary being used. Those are the eyes that see in neuroscience. Okay, so now, the advancements of neuroscience are minuscule. I mean, they haven't made the first step towards reducing normativity to physical, chemical, electric forces. But that's the program. That's the program, a grand reversal of the Turing test. Okay, it's not about a computer who's absolutely confused you because it's behind a screen and you can't tell whether it's human or not. It's not about a computer simulation of human reaction. The assumption is that we are computing devices, period. Very complex, okay, very intricate, many generations advanced on our regular computers, but basically computers. Now, you will never, ever hold a computer accountable, You will never, ever put a computer or even another animal on trial, right? Human normativity is the key to human agency. It's the key to the way in which we judge ourselves, judge others, come together, fall apart, and so on and so forth. And normativity isn't only morals and ethics. I mean, there are norms of science and there are norms of aesthetics and so on and so forth. But the very, very distinction between the appropriate and the causal impulse, and the fact that we're at a constant battle with ourselves, trying to control those impulses by means of what we think is right and appropriate and what we should do. And those, the split image we have of the person we want to, what we want and what we want to want. I mean, this is Harry Frankfurt's famous distinction between first and second order volition. That's fundamental to human agency. Okay, and that is precisely what neuroscience, brain research today is willy-nilly collapsing. Not because it's the better picture, not because it's the more appropriate, but because that is the language it speaks. It doesn't have another language. And therefore, Houston, we have a problem. And I think the problem is not, and I have to tread carefully here, right? It's not as though I'm pulling out a red card to neuroscience and saying, listen, guys, you're missing something important. That's not the point. The point is that this is already having a disruptive effect. Although no neuroscientific advance has been made yet on normativity, except maybe with an fMRI, they'll say, okay, when you're happy, this lights up, and, when you're grieving, this lights up. But that's not to explain anything. That's not a reductive picture of the world. But because the reductive picture of the world is implied by neuroscience, okay, and the grand and worrying implication is this total reduction of normativity to causal impulse. It's already disruptive of normativity. Okay, it's already disruptive. I mean, more and more people are adopting the view that non-normative behavior is not something people should be accountable for, but it's a sign of, the computer being wrong, being sick, being it's a malfunction. Okay. Now that's to pull the rug from under our very agency and humanity. And I think this is where the grand problem lies.
Yes.
Now, let me just say in advance, I don't have a solution. I mean, it's not as though philosophers like me would be able to say, okay, what does science have to add to its repertoire, or what extra volume needs to be added to its vocabulary in order to be able to do this. And that's not the point at all.
Yes.
But I think that for the first time in history, we're facing a unique moment in which. Let me rewind and start that sentence. Eddington's famous two writing desks images, right? The common sense image of the solid oak table. He rests with the volumes he's reading on, and that physicist's table he's got, which is 99 point whatever, total void, and all the rest of particles that are dancing around, and so he says that science will never be able to exorcise the common sense image from his brain. Yet on the other hand, he's convinced that the scientists are right. But rubbing up against common sense is what science does all the time, because the common sense image won't hold scientific water. Okay, but nothing is lost in our picture of the world by replacing it with the fantastic non-commonsensical scientific image itself. But for the first time, I think, science at its very, very best, studying the brain, is losing not only something essential of our picture, our common sense or manifest picture of the world, as Wilfried Sellers calls it, but missing out on something vital, absolutely vital, which not only undermines our picture of the self, it undermines science itself for the reason you raised a second ago. Okay, and that is because science operates by means of normativity, by means of meanings, and not values in the sense of, normative or ethical values. There are those too, but of scientific values. Okay, so there's no way now, if you've undermined the categorical difference between the appropriate and the, and the causal impact, there's now no way for scientists or for philosophers of brain science like Daniel Dennett to claim that the scientific image is better or worthy of paying the price for. Because he now has no standards of scientific propriety, scientific rightness. So this is, I think, to my mind, I've been going on for too long, I'm sure, but I think, to my mind, that the interface at the moment between brain research, okay, on the one hand, at its best, and the philosophy of self-agency, normativity, rationality, everything we seriously and professionally have worked out about ourselves are they're not on a collision course. They have collided already. Yes. And it's a major, major problem.
I think you raise a very important topic as well, in the sense that this is very important. Overall, when you think about the distinction psychiatry is trying to make between quote unquote mad, sad, or bad, this distinction they're trying to make between at what point does somebody have a mental illness and then do not. And you can see this happening time and time again. I think there were what are known as 3 biological revolutions of psychiatry so far, where the field has assumed they have the final answer to a question and will understand mental illness, and then has failed. And we've repeatedly done this in the past. And I always try to make it clear I'm not anti-psychiatry, but it's important to understand a lot of the limitations we have within these fields, because the practical significance and the implications, as you just mentioned, are quite important when it comes to the legal system. How do we manage these people? How do we manage patients? So when do you think it would be possible then for us to make predictions at a more, let's say, accurate level? For example, if you're able to predict someone's behavior to the T, because I know there's certain experiments, I think Professor Uri Maus does where he gets patients and they play a little game where they have to raise one hand in the air. And I think almost a few milliseconds prior to that, the computer that's obviously scanning the brain, reading the mind, lets the person, the examiner, know which hand to pick up before that person picks it up, to let them know you've picked up the same hand as them. And this goes back to Benjamin Libet's experiments with the intention of action. So do you think those predictions, slowly, if we start getting better at this, we'll be able to predict even more important things like emotions, feelings, qualia? Do you think it would ever get to that point?
I don't know. I mean, you're asking me to predict about the force of predictions. I don't know. I mean, what is obvious is that we're very, very complicated beings, and that we're slowly discovering a lot. And Tevin, I mean, I'm not. You said you weren't anti-psychiatrist. I'm not anti-brain research at all. All I'm calling for is a kind of sense of modesty, of an awareness of what they are not able to do, rather than, steamroller it and so on and so forth. But the brain as an organ is extremely complicated, and we're beginning to scratch the surface of neural reactions and these time gaps between the decision made and the action performed, and how you can drive a wedge into that, or by suitable sensors predict in advance certain unwitting type of decisions made. So much of the brain operates involuntarily, thank God. Okay, I mean, even as we speak, the image created by the two eyes and so on and so forth, to the extent that the world we live in is the world experience, and it's between our ears, it's within the skull. We're not looking out right through the windows of the eyes, but rather gazing at a constructed image which our brain creates, and everything to do with that is this is the forefront of research, and we're beginning to get insights, but nothing of that militates against the questions I raised on normativity. That's a large, deep, and philosophical question. There's no room for normativity in brain research, and take normativity away from the human agent, and you've lost the human agent. Now, and then the sort of deep philosophy of science question would be, what is science's job? Is science's job to try and fool itself into thinking that science is creating a picture of reality as it is? Or do you adopt, the picture which, at least from the philosophical quarters I issue forth from, or the world as we experience it? And if the answer is the latter, then our manifest image, or the way in which we experience ourselves as human agents and selves, is crucial for science. And that's the touchstone, should be the touchstone.
And you mentioned Daniel Dennett, and I think so. Something he often talks about are the fact that our intuitions, we need intuition pumps. So he's written a book called Intuition Pumps, Tools for Thinking. And do you think then that all of us have this innate desire to make ourselves more important than we might be? For example, perhaps this is something that will be understood, but we always add layers of complexity to our existence. If you take the Eon Vital and the difference between what is living and what is not, if you think about pre-Darwin thoughts, the fact that we always thought we were at the center of the universe pre-Copernicus, we always seem to add these layers of complexity to ourselves. Do you think that's a problem, or do you think that is something inherently true about us, that we actually are more important than the rest of the other species on this planet?
We're time-bound, dynamic creatures, okay? we can never know what we'll know tomorrow. But the history of our own picture of everything, our notions of the good, our notions of the right, our notions of ourselves, whether embedded in religious worldviews, whether not, they're time-bound to the extreme. Okay, at the present moment, our sense of certainty and certitude is so great that, we're sure we finally arrived at the truth. We look back in history and have this sense of arriving all the time, and yet the train has just stopped for a second and it's traveling on. So looking back in history, looking back at history, trying to recapture the mindset of generations past, centuries past, realizing just how differently, even the words, even when we use the same words, we use them differently. Okay. Just even think of the way in which we envisage the past. Take a well-invested Hollywood movie about ancient Rome. I don't know, Gladiator, something like that. It looks so authentic. We're sucked into this, and we're sure we're experiencing it. But then roll back 30 or 40 years and take a look at a movie seriously made, okay, well invested during the 1960s of the life in Rome, and it looks ridiculous. There are these 60-year-old 1960s hippie-looking types, with long sideburns and puffy hairdos, dressed up in Romans, like a bad Halloween scene. But then you realize that 30 years hence, they'll be looking at what we take to be authentic pictures of the past. So even the past has a history. The past itself, our depiction of the past, has a history. So you're absolutely right. We add complexities, the levels of self-centeredness or decenteredness, and so on and so forth. But even these accounts of looking back are time-bound, and the histories themselves will be reread and rewritten as history progresses. In a sense, this is very depressing because although normativity is as I said, the staple of humanity, normativity changes. The norms, the scientific norms, the epistemic norms, the various values and standards of propriety we have, they themselves change and shift all the time. So the only thing we have that we can trust is our sense of propriety and our sense of certitude, and being honest with ourselves, and at the same time humble by looking back to the past, realizing, that this is the right thing to do now, but God knows how the future will look. So I don't know. That's the long and short of it. If this radical decentralizing, then it would say, of course we have normativity, and of course we have norms, and of course we have intentionality, but that's all in the mind. That's a picture we have, which was useful for evolution to produce, because, we function better that way than the alternative. But where does that word better come from? That again is a kind of built-in norm of his own scientific picture. So I think the only thing we can do at present, to go back to what we were talking about beforehand, is and Wilfred Sellas, well, he wasn't the first. Whitehead began doing this on a sort of grander scale. And then Charles Taylor was doing this as well in his early papers on human agency. And Wilfrid Sellers, he just said, listen, guys, there's a scientific picture, there's a manifest picture, and these pictures jar in a way that neither is capable of taking the other on board, let alone being reduced. But you know, it was kind of theoretical then. I think the problems come to a head now.
I think this problem of trying to understand the mind always reminds me of Karl Popper and his distinction between the science and the pseudoscience when he was talking about Albert Einstein and his predictions with general relativity and how he predicted the eclipse versus Freud and psychoanalysis and the way he spoke about the differences between the two. And it makes me think about psychiatry and mental health and understanding the mind, neuroscience, how difficult it actually is, because even if you do find certain correlates, that doesn't give you the person's history, their experiences throughout time, what led to that decision in that moment, at that point. You only get almost a snapshot of a person's entire being. So it makes it very difficult for us to use these neural correlations as a way to guide our understanding of that person. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, let's start with Popper. I mean, Popper's importance as a philosopher goes without saying, but he's, to my taste at least, although I'm a second generation Popperian, he is way too analytical to be useful to our discussion. Let's talk about criticism. Okay, let's talk about what, you know, a science is a science. What makes a science scientific is not merely that the picture it produces is criticizable. Okay, Aristotle's picture was criticizable. It was adopted uncritically for generations in the Middle Ages, and then it was not scientific. So it's not enough that the picture be analytically criticizable to be deemed scientific, but to be a scientific picture, it has to be criticized in practice, okay, by scientists. Okay. Now, what is it to criticize, Tevin? What is it to criticize? It's to find something wrong. Read my lips. Wrong. Something which is unfitting. Something lacking. Now, all these are normative terms, very, very thin normative terms. Now, what you might find wrong might be radically different from what I find wrong. Okay, a liberal and a conservative going over, say, our new government's plans, one will see a blessing where another will see a grave problem. So criticism, let's roll back. To be rational, according to Popper, and I accept this, lock, stock, and barrel. To be rational is to be critical, is to suspect all the time that with a willingness to correct, okay, in all realms, not only in science. But this is framework dependent in the deepest Kuhnian sense of the word, okay, and you can hear Popper sort of rolling in his grave. I mean, to find something wrong is to find it diverting from a norm.
Yes.
You need a criterion of rightness in order to judge something wrong. Okay, so we're back in normativity again, and that's why normativity is so centrally important, and it's also relative to normative systems. So you can have a perfectly rational person doing X, and a perfectly rational question committed differently doing non-X, right? And that's human rationality and the diversity of normativity for you. But again, take away normativity, and Popper speaks, I have to say this, as though scientific problems speak for themselves. Contradictions. Problems are not contradictions. There are problems large and problems small, and problems pressing and problems not pressing. And they're functions of normative, of our normativity and standards. So we're back to square one. So I'm a deeply committed Popperian with the added dimension of what, what criticism amounts to, and what discerning a problem, what being motivated by a difficulty means. And I mean, in a sense, to my mind, the tragedy of philosophy of science of the latter part of the 20th century is that the two camps diverged. Okay, those who realize that there's no science without commitment to a framework, a normative framework, that's the Kuhnian image, were unable to give an account of how that normative framework could be changed rationally. Because how can you criticize the framework by means, of your critical tools themselves? Because that framework supplies the critical perspective. And others will say everything is criticizable, right? And deny. I mean, Popper's last work is called The Myth of the Framework, which is ridiculous. Now, how do you bring these two systems together? In other words, develop or remain faithful to this Popperian commitment to rationality as criticism, while retaining a framework dependency of the kind that could, and no one except, I think I'm the only philosopher of science who's actually trying and has written about, how to bridge, how to straddle that divide, because both sides need each other. And John McDowell in Mind and World talked about the seesaw, and here it's the same. You can't criticize, you can't speak of criticizing without framework dependency. Okay, but then how can you adopt framework dependency without criticism? So it's the same kind of seesaw. But to go back to the to the mind-body solution or mind-body problem, normativity is still the key.
Your normative understanding of the mind and the body, what do you think is consciousness? How do you think this complex psychological system has been able to manifest itself over time? What is consciousness?
Well, what is consciousness? Fine. I mean, I'm not going to give you a scientific rundown on what part of our, bodily apparatus or whatever is responsible for what, but a sort of philosophical phenomenology of consciousness. I think one of the best pictures we have is that of Harry Frankfurt. Okay, so self-consciousness. That's the key, really. Self-consciousness is not merely an inner eye, like we have an external eye, say, oh, the flowers are blooming, the sky's overcast, and then the inner eye will say, oh, I'm hungry. Oh, I'm beginning to build up a migraine. Oh, I love that. No, self-consciousness is far more than that. Self-consciousness is the seat of our norms. We don't merely say I'm hungry. We say, well, why the hell am I hungry? I've just had breakfast. How do I control that appetite? Or I have this urge to hit, to just slap this bearded philosopher going on and on about normativity in the face and shut him up. But I won't do that, because that's, and so self-consciousness is our ability to split, okay, to step aside of ourselves and to judge what we're doing. and to alienate ourselves from those impulses we do not want to want. The urge for a cigarette, the urge for, the classical second helping of the dessert, and so on and so forth. And although these are arising from within ourselves, we alienate that. We don't identify with those urges. We try to fight them. And other urges we have, which we're happy with and proud of, we'd like to advance and develop, and so on and so forth. And so self-consciousness is about self-judging. And as far as I know, we are the only species of living organism, and there's no computer can do this, is to actually be displeased with ourselves. Self-criticism is the key. And for self-criticism, you need a conceptual language and so on and so forth. But self-consciousness is about our ability, or that part which steps aside, which is the seat of our norms, is also a sort of self-betrayal of who we want to be, judging, and again, pulling out yellow and red cards, to the empirical self, which we're not always pleased with. And of course, that's the source of sort of the exclusively human psychological problems, where that divide is, self-despair. And there are depressed animals, I know that, but I don't think that there's any notion elsewhere in the animal world of self-despair, of surrendering, giving up on yourself, for example. So now it's for scientists to explain the picture, but brain research at the moment, precisely because it's got this big blind spot on normativity, is unable to even articulate self-consciousness in that sense. So the best we have is the sort of the inner eye, aware of what's going on in our mind. But that's not human self-consciousness. I mean, that's only a little tiny part of the picture.
And so this self-consciousness you speak of, I'm assuming it's layered in a temporality, with intentionality, with this vast phenomenological perspective. Because do you then think that there is an approach in mental health called phenomenological psychopathology, or there's also what is known as neurophenomenology now, which seems to be growing. I mean, Karl Jaspers was one of the first people to talk about phenomenological psychopathology. Do you think that's a better approach to these fields, to take it into account more? I know there's another field, J.L. Austin from Oxford. He also talks about this normativity and how people apply this. And it's given way to certain branches of treatments now known as values-based practice. That is not against evidence-based medicine, but rather you combine the both. You want to have a more holistic view of the person-centered medicine. Mm-hmm. Do you think that's a better alternative to our general approach?
I don't know much about it. I'm confessing my ignorance. From the little I hear of what you say in between the lines, it sounds like a very, very good beginning. My own philosophical musings have led me to a conclusion that to go back to the problem, I want to answer you, but
go around it.
And I need to run around the block once. The question I sort of raised as an aside before is how to be rational with regards our own normative system. Mm-hmm. If it's that normative system which allows us to be critical and rational, so how can you criticize your tools of criticism? And the answer, which has been at the heart of my work, I think, now for almost 20 years, is that we cannot do that by talking to ourselves. But there's something about the echo chamber of exposure to the normative criticism of people who are committed differently, which is capable in ways we can't do to ourselves to destabilize our commitment to the norms they're challenging in a way that renders us ambivalent towards them. And then we can sort of, become self-critical about them once they've been demoted in that way. It's tricky, but I think we've all experienced the way in which, encountering serious, trusted critics, trusted not in the sense that they've got it right, but they mean what they say, and they're being honest. They're not trying to score points with an audience above our heads. And an exposure to that kind of criticism, people who think differently can, and we all know, can have that effect. And part of my philosophical work is to try and work out how that comes about. But that's not what I want to say. What I want to say is different. I mean, psychiatry, until recently, had this built-in dialogical element, okay, where a patient is interrogated, engaged in dialogue, conversed with by a psychiatrist, and is able, by means of and within that dialogical conversational setting, create self-distance enough, okay, to enter a process of self-repair nobody can do alone. Okay, you cannot psychoanalyze yourself to the same effect. You can be very, very honest. I mean, you mentioned Kepler before. No, Copernicus. But Kepler had this sort of astrological diary, which was a kind of analysis, which he wrote for many, many years. But I think classical Freudian and neo-Freudian models of psychoanalysis are built without giving an account, right, on the dialogical, conversational, intersubjective, how the intersubjective conversation can have an impact on the intrasubjective. Okay. Now, psychiatry has moved away from that into an evidence-based, relational sort of reductions to relations, but that conversational, dialogical, psychiatry is somehow, I mean, I don't know much, I don't know enough about it to make, but still my sense is that it's moving away from the sort of dialogical setup of classical psychoanalysis into relational, evidence-based, value-based, and so on and so forth, accounts of the situated self, precisely because it's got away from the picture of the self itself as a sort of, in this case, a tormented, malfunctioning, split of the self-conscious and the conscious, or a set of impulses which are uncontrollable, or giving up on controlling, and so on and so forth. And I think that's a profound movement, and it comes accompanied with other things. I mean, I don't know what it's like in South Africa or the rest of the world. In Israel today, it's very, very difficult. Almost at Tel Aviv University, you cannot do a conceptual PhD, okay, a qualitative PhD in psychology in the psychology department. It's all quantitative. It's all quantitative. It's all about questionnaires and statistics. So the department for psychotherapy in the medical school is employing philosophers for those students who want to do, these more theoretical PhDs in psychotherapy. So they've actually managed to get the university to agree that these students will have two supervisors, a philosopher, a sort of a bona fide faculty member of the university, and a crackerjack psychoanalyst from the outside working together, although the second guy doesn't have an appointment at the university as a kind of advisor supervisor. Yes. And I'm involved in a couple of those PhDs, and yeah. So that's the long answer, which should have been, I don't know enough about the actual trends in modern psychiatry you're talking about, but I sense at least that something about the dialogical, that there's so much to be learned about the way in which psychological or mental disease can be addressed by conversation and dialogue. Okay. So psychoanalysts know how to do this very, very well, but the philosophy of the dialogical impact on, the intrasubjective self conversation, self-dialogue is yet to be pursued in more detail. And in the meantime, psychiatry seem to have wandered off, seem to have distanced itself from that. But again, I don't know enough about it to say anything.
Let's take it back to your areas of expertise. I mean, when it comes to this epistemology, I mean, we clearly have limits because of our frameworks and the places we're in. From your own perspective and your research, do you think there are any ways we can go beyond this? Are there tools, perhaps, to assist us in moving and acknowledging at least the normativity we apply to things?
Yeah, I mean, again, the limits of our world. I mean, this is just to take a bumper sticker off Wittgenstein, but the limits of our world are the limits of our languages, and our languages embody our normative vocabularies, and what we, I mean, the linguistic turn, so to speak, is not merely a turn of philosophy towards the malfunctions of language. No, that's the old analytical view. But the profound linguistic turn is a sort of neo-Kantian move, in which what we realize is that our vocabulary is the language we speak, and normativity is part of our normative vocabulary. Our thick normative notions are part of that. It is not merely an artist's platter by which we paint the world, represent the world without and represent the self within. No, those, the languages we speak are constitutive of the world we experience and the self we believe is ours. Okay, and therefore the grand question, to go back now for the third time, is how to create critical distance from that language itself, although you need it in order to create that critical. And I think it's the diversity of normativity and the conversation and the critique we can become exposed to from without, which allows us to create distance. And once you create distance from, certain norms you're committed to, the rest of your normative system can then kick in critically and either stay with them or replace them. But there's no telling in advance that the change will be for the better. This is the only way in which we can momentarily sort of judge that as my grandfather used to say when we asked him how he felt at the age of 94, he said, better than the alternative. So the way we judge which alternative is better and sort of fall on the side of that decision. And then it's not merely a decision and endorsing, and there's those norms become, rooted in, and the new norms we adopt, and they become constitutive of our selfhood and so on. So we can account for the change, and from our perspective, our latter-day perspective, it will always be for the better. But then it depends what the next change will be. So there isn't a linear model of this. There isn't a linear model of this. And again, as I said, histories are written and rewritten, and they sort of bespeak progress, but progress is a very, very elusive. There is an argument to be made that we're moving towards more complexity and an enriched and multifaceted sort of notion of sense and normativity and vocabulary and so on and so forth. Whether this is for the better or not, I don't know. And there's no way of knowing. And we can't stand aside from everything we are, because it's still us who we are, who are trying to stand aside. Many people get claustrophobic within that kind of worldview. And it's lovely to think of science as sort of touching on an objective reality. But I've lost that sense of innocence, I have to say. But then that's my philosophical orientation. That's the world we live in. I mean, there's one biblical book, I think, which captures that fabulously, and that is Ecclesiastes. If you're familiar with it, I mean,
I will.
Okay, so let's not go there, because it'll take too long to explain what I'm talking about. Anyway.
Menachem, I mean, from my perspective, I always think about, I didn't grow up very religious, but my family are Hindu. Hinduism is primarily the religion that my family follows, and half of my family also are Muslim. So culturally diverse in that sense. But for me, I was never very religious. And I often think about but I do think about teleological explanations of where are we going? What is the deeper meaning behind all of this? And I look at even science's lack of answers. Theology, science, philosophy, they're all trying to answer these very profound questions. And we seem to be very far from answers. But in your own words, what do you think is the teleological, the end game? What is the purpose of all of this?
Well, let me talk about my religious orientation. I mean, you can't see it, but I do wear a skull cap, and I define myself as an observant Jew. But I'm a Talmudic Jew, and I want to explain that. The Talmudic literature, this is the rabbinical literature which began being produced after the destruction of the temple. The temple was destroyed in 70 AD. So basically, rabbinical Judaism set forth as the Jesus movement was setting forth out of Judaism. And that is where we became the people of the book, writ large. But our book isn't the Bible. The book is a vast literature of biblical interpretation and legal development. Okay, a vast literature. I mean, you can see part of it in the bookshelves behind. Now, what makes that literature absolutely unique is that it's diverse in the extreme. Nobody of the discussants on record, of the rabbinic sages on record, denies the fact that the biblical text is revealed from above. Yet no one of them ever claims that his reading of any verse is the one true word of God. And the compilations themselves, the editors of the compilations, never ever adjudicate between the various readings. And there's not one verse I can think of where one reading is proposed. It's always, here comes another one, and this rabbi said this, and this rabbi said that. So it's about, I think, I talked at the very beginning about the philosophy embedded in science, or the philosophy presumed in science. There's a philosophy embedded in the Talmudic literature. And the philosophy embedded is that even God cannot control the meaning of his revelation, because it will always be filtered through the specific, local, time-bound, contextually situated vocabularies of his readers. Even if they use the very same words, they'll be using them according to their sense of their meaning. And it's not merely repeating the revelation, you have to articulate it and make it explicit. And then, you provide images and allegories and metaphors and likenings, and to conceptualize is always to liken something to something else. And this is a literature which is produced and edited by means of a profound sense of the diversity of what receiving a divine revelation means. And that is diversifying it according to the diversity of the normative vocabularies of the different. And the same applies, by the way, to law. Now, law has to be decided. It's never decided because the rabbis decide that this is the one true word of God. It's decided by majority vote, which is, totally prosaic, according to the, who managed to convince the other. And it's always temporary. So this law book is then passed down to the Talmudic commentaries, and where it's reopened again and never adjudicated. So the notion of receiving Torah, receiving God's revelation, is one in which there seems no need for truth. In an objective, God-given sense we can lean on. Not in the legal realm, and not in the theological, narratological, whatever realm of the rest of revelation. That is not the view of Christianity, at least after Nicaea and Islam. And it's very difficult to live within a diverse system like that, to live religiously. And the yearning for a teleology of a law you can lean on, something which will save you from having to discuss things and reopening things anew all the time. So that temptation of a dictatorial, from the word dictate, but I mean they come from the same, for a dictatorial system which will govern you without you having to think too much for yourself, that temptation is enormous. And therefore, the post-Talmudic Judaism resembles, for all its differences, Christianity and Islam for all their differences, but at least and this comes accompanied with other theological things. But I'm a Talmudic Jew, and in a sense, and I have to say this, it took me a long time to realize that I wasn't merely applying my philosophy to the Talmud, but the Talmud now serves me as a kind of paradigm of what I'm trying to say in philosophy, which I don't find in science. I mean, that that total relaxed comfort with a diversity of views. So, to go back, just to end this with, to go back to that that moment in the Hebrew Bible after the flood, right, where the new generation of humans get together to build the Tower of Babel, all marching to the same drum. And then God sort of comes down and diversifies their languages. And suddenly, people have different opinions, and you can't get all humanity to, to invest and follow the leader. And this is read by so many, especially religious people, as a punishment, as a divine punishment for this hubris. But I think the right way to read it is the very last element in the creation of humanity as we understand it, where the diversity of opinion is the key to enrichment and, mutual challenge, intersubjective critique, and moving forward. And that's the only way in which we can, create a critical distance from our own frameworks by means of rubbing up against other people's frameworks. And so there's something communal about the self itself in that sense. And, I have to say that within philosophy, and I think you can attest to that, there's a lot of work done on the intersubjective, dialogue, philosophy of language, society, collectives, and so on and so forth. And there's a lot done on the intrasubjective, but they never meet. I mean, that Hegelian moment where Kant's autism, right, that it meets other selves, that wonderfully pregnant moment of German idealism, post-Kantian German idealism, is now beginning to inform philosophy as we're doing it today. But still no one, not even Hegel, has attempted to work out how the impact of intersubjective dialogue can have on the intrasubjective. The sort of the self is situated within this intersubjective context, yes. But working out exactly, it's not merely internalizing the dialogue. It's simply not. Anyhow,
if you had to just to end it off, or if you had to give the listeners or the viewers 5 authors that you think have impacted your life the most, your entire career, would you be able to make a top 5? Because I often find that people who listen or watch professors speak, and they often want to know how they got to that point and what added to their framework the most. So I often like asking this question. So if you had to give us 5, what would those 5 be?
5.
Yeah. If it's possible.
Wow. Well, I mean, not in the order of importance.
Yes. Just
and I'm not going to explain them. I'd say Maimonides would probably be among the 5. Kant would certainly be among the 5. Popper would be among the 5. More as a boxing bag but still with that major intuition. How many have I counted so far? 3, right? I'd probably add Robert Brandom to the list. And then it would be a toss-up between Sellers and McDowell, probably. Okay. But this is very, this list has to do with where I stand at the moment. Okay, yeah. And since my work now is moving in, and you actually you actually mentioned very, very briefly the topic which we never got to discuss, and that is emotions. So there are people working on emotions today, which may end up, being more informing of my thinking than they are today. But give a philosopher 5 minutes and you kill him, because we need an hour to articulate. They give me a list of 5 and you're killing me too, because I would have added talmudic source, I would have added, and so on and so forth. And Bacon and Descartes, again, not because they, I took something from them, but they began a discussion which ended up very far from where they were, and so on and so forth.
Anyone in particular currently today that you're reading that you find very fascinating? Do you think we should check out?
Again,
sorry, I said anyone today that you're reading who's currently alive, whose work you think is something worthy of checking out. Who would you suggest?
I'd say Brandom and McDowell and their differences.
Okay.
The so-called Pittsburgh Hegelians. I mean, these guys are at the forefront of the current update of that marvelous, fascinating post-Kantian moment of German idealism, which has now come alive with latter-day notions of language and normativity.
Okay.
And after Newtonian science fell apart. Okay, so Kant has been relativized. Kuhn actually says somewhere that he's a Kantian working with categories on wheels. Okay, so all that has become dynamic in a very, very, very interesting sense. Some of the work coming out of the Frankfurt Schule is very, very interesting in that respect. But within the Anglophone analytical philosophy, which has grown out of the classics of the beginning of the 20th century, I think McDowell and Brandom epitomize where philosophy is at the moment, from my perspective.
Well, Menachem, thank you so much for joining me on this podcast. I mean, very fascinating, very enlightening. Anything you want to add before we end the show?
No, just that I enjoyed myself far more than I thought I would, being quizzed about, the mind-body solution. Thank you so much, Tevin. It's been a pleasure.
It's an absolute pleasure. Thank you very much. I really look forward to when this episode airs, and I'm sure the listeners are going to enjoy it.
Thank you. Thank you so much.